Thank you. You mention in your acknowledgements and your thanks to different people the dinner group in Gaelic in relation to the title. And was that which you were elaborating upon when you talked about the impact of the silk on the skin? Or what was the Gaelic dinner group reference?
It's actually the dinner group in Gaul, Sri Lanka.
Okay.
The thing that I'm worst at, I mean, there are many things I'm not very good at as a writer, but the thing I'm worst at is titles. Cartography I came up with on my own, I'm very proud of it, but In the City by the Sea, Broken Verses, Burnt Shadows, none of these are titles I had anything to do with whatsoever. So I had finished writing Burnt Shadows, it was done, my publishers had bought it, and I had no title. And I was at the Gaul Literary Festival, this was in 2008, and my editor from England was there. And we were at dinner with a group of people. Some were friends, and a few were sort of people who just kind of somehow attached themselves to our dinner party. And one of my friends said, "So what's the title of your novel?" And I said, "I don't have one." And my editor, who is a woman of great presence and personality, said, "Right, we are not leaving here till we get a title." And I thought, oh God, she means this, we're going to be here all night. And someone said, what is the book about? And she mentioned that image I was just talking about the woman with the burns. And there was an Australian man who was sitting there. And he just said, "Burnt Shadows."
Mm-hmm.
And we said, my editor and I looked at each other. And actually, before that, he said many terrible things like uranium dreams and plutonium nightmares, I think was sort of the best of them all. But at a certain point, when I was really thinking, please be quiet, you annoying man, he suddenly said, "Burnt Shadows." And my editor and I just looked at each other, and she said, "That could work." And I said, "That could work." And then what was even funnier was about 4 days later, I was at the Jaipur Festival, and I was talking to a friend of mine who'd written a book on the progressive writers movement called Anthems of Resistance. And he said, "Oh, were you thinking of the Ludhianvi poem?" And I said, "What?" And then I realized that, of course, it was a poem that I had read while I was writing the novel, in which there is a called Parchaya, in which I've gone and translated as, "In past wars only homes burnt, but this time don't be surprised if only loneliness ignites. In past wars only bodies burnt, but this time don't be surprised if even shadows ignite," which is of course a terrible translation, but you'll have to forgive me that. So there it was, that I had read this book and been struck by this poem while writing the book. And yet it was later through this completely other Australian way that I came up with a title that referred right back to Sahib Ludhianvi.
It's interesting because, of course, you also show the influence of the English patient and that story about the war in the chapter title that you use for an unnecessary sense of loss. The speed
necessary. Yeah, there's a line in the English patient, but he moved at the speed necessary to replace loss, which is, of course, a beautiful line. And again, the English patient is one of those books that has really been very important to me and stayed with me a long time. And in the way, again, that when you write, you don't know what you're doing or where your influences are. It was only when the book came out and a reviewer said, and here's a book which starts the moment the English patient ends, which is true. The English patient ends with an Indian soldier called Kip hearing about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and sort of leaving the Europeans because even though they've been together for a while, he just says, you wouldn't have done this to a European nation, which actually I don't think is true. They would have done it to a European nation. And he sort of leaves them. But this book sort of picks up from that moment and moves forward. And there's a lot of influence of the English patient in this one.
Yes, I felt that I could recognize some of the echoes. And of course it is one of those books that actually captures the suffering and the horror of being burnt.
Yes.
Terrible. Actually, one of the things that I felt when I read all your books very rapidly in the last 2 months was that it's a very, very strong sense of loss. It's as if the theme of loss is one that you keep returning to, and a large part of the book is this yearning for a person who's meant a great deal, who disappears from one's life. And I wonder if you could elaborate upon why you focus on this theme so obsessively.
Well, I hate to admit that a lot of it was, and a lot of it is laziness, actually. One of the reasons that I took 2 years between writing Broken Verses and Burnt Shadows was I realized that I'd fallen into certain habits and patterns as a writer. And one of them, the most obvious one to me, was in Salt and Saffron, in Broken Verses, to some extent in cartography as well, and in, if you take the uncle in The City by the Sea, although less so there really, but it's there, the character of the widow. It was dramatically interesting and therefore easy to have characters who are looking at an absence and trying to fill it or figure it out. And it really became sort of, I'm thinking of a novel, and it was almost as though there was a groove in my brain which I had used too often, and I just take the story there. This is, of course, a thing that writers never admit. You know, we like to say that if we're writing about a theme repeatedly, it's because that theme is of great interest to us. Very often it's because that's the theme we wrote about last time, it paid dividends, we're doing it again. So there was a certain kind of laziness as well in that, you know, and also, well, I'll tell you the first time what it was. Within The City by the Sea, there's a character called the widow. And she's sort of a, you know, a supporting character in there. But she's a character who is made up entirely of loss. She lives in her dreams, and in her dreams she is with her husband, and the waking world is not really interesting to her. And actually, that character I felt I wanted to do more with. And so when I write about Maryam Apa in Salt and Saffron, the next book, in effect what I was doing was picking up that story of the widow, that half-finished story, and giving it a place. So with Salt and Saffron, it wasn't laziness. It was the writer going back to the previous book and saying, here's what feels unfinished. Let me expand on it. But having done that in 2 books, it then did become a kind of habit. It's sort of, I did this before, it's dramatically interesting, it's a way to tell the story. And that's, when I finished Broken Verses, I was going to take about 3 or 4 months off before writing the next one. And in those 3 or 4 months, I was judging a prize, the Orange Award for New Writing. And I had to read 72 novels in 7 weeks. And when you have to read 72 novels in 7 weeks, you really notice the themes that keep appearing. And one of the things that kept appearing, the amount of novels in which people write about some secret from the last generation, which they have to now solve, someone who disappeared, some hidden part of the story. It's actually one of those story lines which is repeated again and again and again. And I sort of, in these 72 books, came upon it in about 10 novels, and by the 11th I was saying, God, not another one. And then this horrifying realization came to me, which was, I've done this in all my books. And I thought that, well, there's no way I'm doing that again. So I ended up actually taking about 1.5 years off before writing Burnt Shadows in order to let go of all those old habits of thought, so that when I came to Burnt Shadows, there is loss, but it's of a different kind. It's of place. It's of, you lose Nagasaki, you lose Delhi, you lose Afghanistan as it existed before the war. And that to me now is sort of a more interesting. So it's still, you know, obviously there's something in me that is going around these subjects. But to me it's more interesting now in terms of what history takes away from us. And of course any one of us who are living in Pakistan, I think this is an idea that we all live with. What history is taken away from us, those past versions of a city, those imagined futures of a city, which have been decimated. And so why do I write about those? Because I'm from Karachi.
It's true that there's a sense of the loss of the place, but it seems to me that the main character in Burnt Shadows certainly accommodates to each new place she comes, and what she doesn't get over is the loss of the people, the loss of Conrad, the loss of Sajjad, and ultimately the loss of her friend when she moves to New York. So she keeps moving, and every time she moves, it also seems to me that the loss of her son, which...
I think that, you know, well, again, we don't want to give too much away for anyone who perhaps might want to read the book and hasn't already. But actually, I think, for me, Hiroko is a woman actually who's very, very good at dealing with loss, because she doesn't try to pretend it hadn't happened, but she moves forward. She doesn't, you know, when Conrad dies, she doesn't then become so consumed that she can't move on. You know, she does move forward, but the people who've been in her past and the cities that have been in the past are part of who she is. And she recognized them. And the question at the end of the book is, has she finally suffered a loss too far?
to turn to another aspect, I thought that the symbol of the spider's webs, which you keep using, in a sense, you indicate to the reader that we'll all connect with each other, and you see these people connecting with each other. But ultimately, there's this terrible, grim irony in the fact that the people that you love most are the people that you ultimately betray, because of the way the story develops. You find that Harry is indirectly betraying the person he really cares for. Kim betrays the person she would really care for. So there is such a terrible, tragic irony there.
There's I hope, a sense of duality. That there are some relationships in this book that weather astonishing things. There are these two women who are apart for 50 years. They meet again, they're from entirely different countries, different social positions, although that's not as marked. They've been apart for 50 years, led different lives, become different people. 50 years later, they meet again, and the friendship is intact. If anything, it's grown. And to me, actually, the most important relationship in this book of many relationships is Hiroko and Ilse, although you see them together very little. But it is really the story of what does and can survive. But there are lots of things that don't survive. And there are lots of relationships, and that it's not the simplistic world where if you mean well, it'll be fine. It's not a simplistic world where, if you care about someone, you won't hurt them. Well, of course, that's not true in any way. And so this book was, I hope to show these different sides of it, and the question of what does and what doesn't survive became quite central to it.
Yes, you certainly do that extremely well, and one of the things that survives in a number of the novels are female friendships, the question of sisterhood. That's something that I think is very clear.
It does. I think with a lot of the characters, there's a sense of, well, for one thing, I think a lot of the women in the novels, perhaps because they have to fight against certain expectations of society and certain demands that a patriarchal society puts on them, it makes them question a lot more and be a little more disdainful of the rules. You can go either way with women in a patriarchal society. Either they really conform to the rules, or they realize that the rules themselves are deeply problematic. And it makes them a little more rebellious, and perhaps increases their compassion for other people who are breaking the rules. And also an understanding that there has to be a kind of solidarity, that you have to stand with each other. And I think in a lot of the books that has come through.
I have an awful lot of questions that I'd like to ask you, but I know that I have only 15 extra minutes added to this session because of our starting late. So first of all,
to anyone who wants to go through other sessions, I'm assuming this means that all sessions are running in 15 minutes.
I think all sessions are running 15 minutes.
Yes, so if you want another to go to the next session,
15 minutes.
That will undoubtedly also have been delayed 15 minutes, so you shouldn't be missing anything.
I have it in print.
It's in print, therefore it must be true. All things written are true.
We've learned that, haven't we? I wanted to ask you if you had a piece that you wanted to read from one of your books.
I can read a couple of minutes from cartography. This is just, since we are in a Karachi winter, it's just a description, a page-long description of a Karachi winter. My litany of Karachi winter characteristics runs something like this: dry skin, socks, peanuts roasted in their shells and bought by the pow in bags made of newspaper, peaches that you twist just so to separate them into halves, flesh falling cleanly off seed, the silence of no fan and no air conditioner, hibiscus flowers, shawls, days at the beach, which involve a litany of their own: salted fish air, turtle tracks, shout of warning from the fishermen just before toes tangle with their near invisible lines, fishermen's baskets full of dead fish, fishermen's nets drawn into shore, warm sand, wet sand, feet slippery on rock moss, jeans rolled up as we wade and rolled down again heavy with salt and sea, shells, sparks from the barbecue, the concentrated colors of sunset, stars, the rings of sand on the bathtub, the fog of mirrors in the bathroom, the smell of salt and skin as we fall asleep despite the earlier soap and scrubbing, the forgetting of everything that bothered us at the start of the day, the sheer childhood of it all. But really, For Karachi high society, winter is about envelopes. Or rather, about the invitations inside the envelopes. They start to appear in 2s and 3s in early November, and by New Year, every house has a shrunken mirror. That is absurdly oblique. I mean, the invitation cards get pushed into those crevices between the dressing table mirror and its frame, encroaching on the space that exists for reflection. This is true of invitations to parties. The wedding invitations are another matter entirely. Dholkis, mehndis, mayus, milad, shame rangs, ganas, shadi receptions, walimas. Among the absurdly extravagant, there's a card for every occasion, except the actual wedding ceremony itself, which hardly anyone attends. And the envelopes that arrive are so bloated with demands on your time that they cannot squeeze into cracks between wood and glass and must have their own space on the dressing table top to lie back, engorged and insolent. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely every reviewer of your books that I have had the privilege of reading comments on your enormous inventiveness when it comes to the use of language. In every book, one is delighted by the puns, and the one that particularly sticks in my mind is the poet's use of raison d'être, the French expression, which he calls your reason of death. And I thought, this is something I simply have to use. I have to go around asking people their reasons of death rather than their raison d'être. This enormous sensitivity to language and punning, could you elaborate on that? Because it's so special.
To me, language has sort of always been something I see almost like plasticine. In cartography, the characters speak in anagrams to each other. I never spoke in anagrams to anyone else, but in my head as a child, I was almost obsessively, I would see a word and I would make anagrams of it. I still do to some extent. I would see a word written and I would write it backwards, say it backwards to myself, because I just like flipping the letters about and seeing what happens. So for me, a lot